All right, thanks, Jess. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the monthly installment of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center's monthly science seminar. I'm Melissa Welch. I might need a do-over for that intro, but I'm Melissa Welch, the program manager for the Midwest CASC, hosted at the University of Minnesota. A big welcome to those who are joining us for the first time today, and those who are already familiar with the Midwest CASC's work. We're pleased to have you here. A big thanks to the ongoing and diligent work of our communications manager, Jess Del Fiacco, as well, for organizing this session. So as many of you may know, we use the acronym CASC for the Climate Adaptation Science Center. So you'll hear us refer to the shorthand for that throughout today's presentation. And a reminder again, the presentation is being recorded. So please adjust your video settings and mute your microphones throughout the session. If at any point you have questions, please feel free to add them into the Zoom chat or the question field as that is active. We will take some questions at the end of the presentations, at which point you can either enter those by chat or come off mute and ask your questions. Before we begin, I'll provide just a very brief background on the Midwest CASC as a reminder to the importance of our regional research collaborations. Midwest CASC is a partnership between USGS and a consortium of our 8 institutions across the region hosted by the University of Minnesota. Those institutions are on the map here in front of you. We are part of a national network of regional CASCs, all of which work to produce science that seeks to inform research management efforts and that help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. And we work on research topics that are specific to our Midwest region. We accomplish our mission in a couple ways, including conducting synthesis research on relevant regional priorities. We support a network of graduate students and postdoc fellows. We partner with consortium member College of Menominee Nation to offer a summer undergraduate research program. And we support USGS-funded climate adaptation research projects. We also host capacity building workshops and an annual gathering of our Midwest CASC community. Next slide. Thanks. So the one announcement that we have today, and you may have seen this already if you follow us, is that we are saving the date for our 2025 annual gathering to occur at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign the first week of August. Please reach out if you have any questions, and do watch for registration to open for that in the next few weeks. All right. So we are pleased to welcome today's speakers, and I'll just give their brief bios here before we turn it over to them. Our first speaker is Jacy Bernath-Plaisted. He is an applied conservation scientist with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and a former Midwest CASC fellow. Jacy has a broad interest in the conservation of grasslands and grassland birds, climate adaptation, and solutions for working landscapes. His past work has examined specific applications, such as the effects of energy development on grassland songbirds in the Great Northern Plains, and exploring full annual cycle demographics for sensitive grassland bird species. In his recent doctoral work, Jacy explored the microclimate ecology of grassland birds with an eye towards climate adaptation and worked with management professionals to develop a climate adaptation menu for grassland systems. In his present capacity as an applied conservation scientist, Jacy works to better connect research and management and explore the effectiveness of Farm Bill practices for North American bird conservation. Our second speaker will welcome Olivia LeDee, who is our USGS Regional Administrator for the Midwest CASC. Olivia is previously worked for the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and the USGS Northeast Climate Science Center before coming to the Midwest CASC. Throughout her career, Olivia has worked closely with state and federal agencies and non-governmental organizations to understand the effects of climate change on natural resources and respond with active management. She represented the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies on both the Department of Interior's Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resource Science, and the Joint Implementation Working Group of the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy. Very excited to have these experts with us here today, and I will pass it over to Jacy. Jacy, do you want to start sharing your slides? See if that's working for us. Oh, excuse me. Sounds like Olivia's going first.
I think I'm up first. I'll set the stage for Jacy. So talking a little bit broader about migratory bird research. So I'm glad all of you are able to join us today. So this is a presentation, and actually Jacy's presentation is part of a symposium that we did working with the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes joint venture about climate science to benefit migratory bird management. And we also hosted a workshop, which you'll hear more about in the future. So what we wanted to do was a bit of a review of climate science related to migratory bird management. Taylor Siddons helped pull together this foundational research. And so what I'm going to talk today is also about how migratory bird science has been in service of our climate research. So really noting the contributions of migratory bird research to climate studies, because we've had decades and decades of observations of birds, and it's really helped us to accelerate our understanding of climate change. Look at sort of the last 10 to 20 years on climate impacts and adaptation research, and then talk a little bit about knowledge gaps and research opportunities, and then open for Jacy to talk about really interesting grassland research and microclimate and impacts on songbirds. So let's start with this early migratory bird research. Well, 1990s, early 2000s are when some of those seminal climate change papers were coming out. So these are publications in Nature, PNAS, and a lot of these, although flowers are often included, a lot of these lean on decades of bird observations. So the study that was led by Leopold in observations and picked up by his daughter. So they had 61 years of arrival dates for dozens and dozens of migratory birds. And with that baseline information, they were able to document phenological shifts and early arrivals. The same for the root paper, where you have over 30 years, right? Because if climate signature is at least 30 years, dozens of studies, hundreds of species, right? Where they were able to detect a statistically significant shift towards earlier timing. Range shifts was also one of those earlier areas of a lot of research. So on your right is the equivalent, the French equivalent of the breeding bird survey, where 20 years of breeding bird data, hundreds of species, where they can see that birds are rapidly tracking warming. It's higher than previous estimates, but not sufficient to demonstrate enough adaptive capacity to keep up. And then also showing that for 20 years, 150 species, seeing that shift in the northern range of species up to sort of 19 kilometers, so substantial. Thinking about migration, so we're seeing, early 2000s, the studies are getting a little bit more complex, but they are now to individual species, and you're not seeing research on dozens of species for this level of complexity. So a 20+ year study on the pied flycatcher, which you'll see again in another study, where we start hearing the difference between long distance and short distance migrants. And that adaptation for long distance migrants is constrained by its behavior and physiological constraints in migration. So another Carey study, 40+ years with 65 migratory birds. Again, also re-emphasizing sort of the advantage for short distance migrants being really responsive to seasonal ambient conditions, whereas long distance migrants have had limited ability to take advantage of those changes. Again, as I said, we do have another pied flycatcher, right? As we get into increasing complexity of our understanding of climate change, it's not system-wide or taxa-wide, but 20-year study on pied flycatcher is where we start talking about asynchrony and mismatch with prey. And then this study actually linking it to population declines, to reproductive success and population declines, which often studies have focused on phenology, range shifts, very limited information related to these changes and its impacts on demography. So let's take a moment and review some more recent advances. So those were the early ones, again, showing how some of these early climate biodiversity papers really leaned on birds. But let's look at what's happening now. So we did a rapid review for migratory birds and climate change for the last 20 years. And we did a course screening for relevance. And we structured the information collection along the categories on the right, everything from timing to location to asynchrony to morphology to genetic considerations, and did a structured review of 96 articles. And we both collected information on observed and projected change, but I'm only going to talk about observed change. So more recent research, still supporting poleward shifts in the breeding range. Although we do see in some areas, like in Australia, where there might be more sensitivity to moisture, temperature combinations. We see advances in laying date by up to 25 days, right? So really far acceleration, but not necessarily an increase in the breeding season length. The implications of these changes on reproductive success are mixed, where increasing success for some populations and not for other populations. And you can see on the right sort of the difference in initial lay date between 1872 and 2017. And if you're below the dotted line, that is a advance in your laying date. And again, the advance in laying date is up to average of 25 days, but you can see some greatly exceeding that. Migration. As we would expect, species-specific change in arrival time, most earlier, again, similar graph. So I don't know, dozens of species here, a couple dozen. The arrival date, if it is below that dotted line, that's earlier arrival, right? Where you see only a couple of tree swallow vireos not showing a significant arrival date. Some interesting things of looking at sex-based variation in response to arrival times. We know that for some migratory species, you see both age and sex structure variation in their geographic distribution as well as their migratory behavior. So sex-based variation in response to climate change in their arrival times. We're also seeing delayed departures from breeding grounds. For some species, faster migration. And then, as many folks have talked about species that are now overwintering, we see a lot of species migrating shorter distance that are short stopping, so not going full, not expending all of their energy to go farther for better resources. For the non-breeding season, we see some really being responsive to local conditions, and so earlier departure, and really being responsive during migration to those changing ambient conditions. Some evidence for carryover effects on arrival dates, so what's happening on breeding and wintering grounds, influencing the other season. And then another interesting study of looking at drought conditions and extreme weather and whether or not birds can demonstrate flexible migration and use suboptimal habitat during difficult conditions, and this one's drought. So some other findings that are of interest, looking at some evidence of population declines and local extirpation, evidence of reduction in body size and increase in wing length. And another study just talking about the challenge in teasing out the implications for changes in temperature, precipitation, climate, is because it acts on multiple temporal and spatial levels on these populations. And that is making it difficult to tease out some of these mechanisms. So just to stop for a moment and think about knowledge gaps and research opportunities. I alluded to it a little bit, but really thinking about the so what of logical shifts, so what of range shifts. Um, what are the population level effects of climate change on migratory birds, especially on survival? Um, what about understudied species? Again, I often joke, like we know lots for mallards or blue-winged teal, but what about other species? And then often sort of changes in community dynamics in assemblages, especially as you see range shifts and new competitor dynamics. How does that affect resident populations? The vulnerability of stopover habitat, so availability, quality, vulnerability to climate change, opportunity for adaptation, as you saw in that sort of the impoundments during drought. So what is it? Where is it? Is at risk? Wintering habitat, the vulnerability to climate change. I often use the statistic that like 90% of redhead ducks winter on this one barrier island chain in Louisiana, right? And don't necessarily demonstrate much adaptive capacity, right? Because of site fidelity. What is the vulnerability? How does that affect the population? And then thinking about plasticity and adaptive capacity in habitat use. Do we see shifts? Do we see use of alternative habitats that offer the same benefits as preferred habitat? So that's it for me in sort of a big brush. You can find out more from us. And that's it. I'll turn it over to Jacy.
All right, is that looking okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. My name's Jacy. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to present some of my doctoral work at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, kind of exploring how microclimates might inform our view of climate vulnerability for grassland songbird community. And this work was funded in part by a Midwest CASC fellowship that I was very happy to receive. And so it's kind of a fun bookend for me to be here presenting to you guys on this. And I also just want to acknowledge my advisors, Dr. Benjamin Zuckerberg, as well as Dr. Chris Ribick, who worked very closely with me on this. And yeah, with that, I will go ahead and start here. Oh, let's see if I can advance my slide. It's not advancing. There we go. Okay. So before we get really into the details of the grassland bird work here, we're just going to take a minute and talk about, why would we be interested in microclimates? We have just recently kind of hit this 1.5 degrees Celsius warming threshold. And so, as Olivia just presented to you guys on, we're obviously having a lot of interest on how these changing climate conditions are going to affect organisms. This is a great figure from Morale et al., basically estimating the proportion of species that are going to experience climate conditions that are really outside of anything that they would have experienced in their evolutionary histories. And so we really might think that this exposure is going to have significant consequences for many organisms. And so when we're thinking about the vulnerability of those organisms, there's a lot of factors that might affect that and create sort of diversity in how species will respond and be affected. And so, traditionally, this is kind of conceptualized with this vulnerability triangle, where we're going to have, some intrinsic factors like sensitivity, how inherently sensitive is the life history of a species, and maybe some things that also affect its adaptive capacity. So, maybe its genetic variation across its range, its sort of behavioral flexibility. But then we also have this extrinsic factor when we're talking about exposure. So what really are the conditions that this species does and will experience? And I think that's really where this idea of microclimates has some relevance for us. And so, there are meteorological definitions of microclimate. So often that's defined as sort of the near surface climate conditions at maybe a horizontal scale of less than 100 meters squared or something like that. But ecologically, really what we're talking about is the idea that habitat is a mediator of climate conditions. And there's a lot of reasons that this can happen. So one reason is just that when you're right at the surface of the Earth, you actually get different sort of biophysical processes that affect climate. So you have less efficient mixing processes with air currents and convection and eddy diffusion and things like that. And you also have storage of energy and heat in the ground. So those inherently create more extremes near the surface. And then you sort of also have this variation in microtopography and hydrology and vegetation cover that can all sort of create more variation. So I think it's, fairly intuitive that, as you're going up in elevation, maybe you're going to get some cooler temperatures. As you have small depressions and valley effects, you might actually get cooler, denser air cooling there. And then you're also going to get shade. So of course, forests are going to provide shade. Vegetation is going to provide evaporative cooling. So there's all of these kind of fine scale processes on the landscape that can be really relevant for organisms, especially when we're talking about sort of crossing critical thresholds under a more extreme climate. And so, traditionally, most of our sort of grid climate products that often have been used in ecological analyses, they tend to be around, 1 kilometer grid cell. We're getting better with that. That's improving. But you can imagine that there's actually a lot of sort of variation lost within that resolution if we're assuming that conditions are homogeneous. And so, just looking at this kind of idealized landscape, we can imagine that actually within this 1 kilometer grid cell, there's forest, there's grassland, there's a riparian zone, there's an elevational gradient. And so if you're a small bodied organism that's actually interacting with that habitat at a very fine resolution, you may actually be experiencing different conditions and possibly exploiting that heterogeneity in a way that we're really not capturing if we just say, that's all the same. So that's really what this idea of microclimates is about. And so with this work, we were specifically exploring grassland birds. So, why were we interested in grassland birds? I'm sure many of grassland birds really for some time have been a modern conservation crisis in North America. So they're, among the most steeply declining avian assemblage on the continent. This has been going on really since we have our first data in the 60s and 70s from the Breeding Bird Survey. And we kind of know what's underlying this. So really, it's been since European colonization of the Americas, we've had just, massive habitat loss, degradation, disruption of fire and grazing regimes. And more recently, we've got things like neonicotinoid compounds, energy development, and now we have climate change. And we know that grassland birds actually can be quite sensitive to climate conditions. So, not only are they exposed, so this is kind of showing the difference between current climate normals and future projected climate normals and increases in maximum temperature. And so we can see, a lot of that deep purple in the Great Plains, a lot of our grassland areas, they have a high exposure to these extreme temperatures. And for many grassland birds, this example is with Henslow sparrow, we can really see that, it's kind of its whole breeding range is probably going to be affected by this. And we know from great work that folks have already done that, high maximum temperatures, drought conditions, these tend to depress reproductive success in grassland birds. So they really have both sensitivity and exposure. So that's kind of going back to that idea about what goes into climate vulnerability. But there's another thing that's interesting about grassland birds, thinking about this idea of exposure. And that's really that they have these very specific microhabitat and vegetation height and density preferences. So even though they're all kind of inhabiting these similar grassland regions throughout the United States, within those regions, they could actually be having differential exposure really based on, say, their nest site preferences, their foraging preferences. And so we could imagine that looking at these species on the left side, these are kind of some of our true grassland obligates, true ground nesters. They really are preferring, sparser vegetation. Maybe they're getting less shade, less evaporative cooling relative to, say, some of these facultative or shrub-associated species that are, nesting in very dense habitat. And so that kind of is the fundamental hypothesis that is underlying this work. And more specifically, we're going to kind of look at two things here. And so one really is just this idea that, your kind of microhabitat preferences, your nest site selection, the locations that you're using, that could actually influence your exposure to these realized microclimate conditions. And our second hypothesis is, given that grassland birds do traditionally show kind of a negative response to high heat, high drought conditions, that there could be demographic consequences associated with this microclimate exposure and these habitat associations. So I'm not going to get really detailed with the methods here because we don't have a lot of time, but I'll just give you sort of a general overview. So our approach to this was, yes, we wanted to monitor grassland birds and see how they're responding to climate, but there really has been very little work done actually modeling grassland microclimate. So that was kind of the first thing that we needed to do. And so we took an approach basically where we had these sort of 10, 12 hectare sites in Wisconsin, and these were sort of planted tall grass prairie restorations, as well as some sort of cool season tame grasslands. Those are both habitats that grassland birds use. And we basically put out a systematic grid of climate loggers at the near surface level, about 5 centimeter height. So we used eye buttons, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And basically we use those to kind of get hourly temperature and humidity measurements. And then we wanted to basically relate those to sort of continuous covariates that would sort of cover the whole site so that for any given location, we could kind of estimate microclimate. And so we used drone imagery that sort of captured a bunch of relevant aspects of the environment. So we looked at things like vegetation height and primary productivity, microtopography, and we used machine learning to basically create these models. And so this is kind of what this product looks like. So here you're looking at anomaly. So that's basically how different is a particular pixel from the average pixel at that location. So what were sort of the hot and cool spots, the dry and humid spots. And we basically use this product to then associate with the locations of the grassland bird nests that we were monitoring. And so here's a look at our grassland bird community. And there's kind of two groups that I'm going to pull out for you here. So we have our grassland obligate species. So here we've got eastern meadowlark, dickcissel, Henslow sparrow, bobolink, and grasshopper sparrow. And so these are really birds that are 100% dependent on these grasslands during their breeding season. So they really can't use anything else. This is their habitat. And these species tend to be true ground nesters, and they tend to be associated with a little bit sparser vegetation conditions. They're not going to use a lot of shrubland or woody encroachments. They're not going to use super dense vegetation. An exception to that is dickcissel, which is a little bit shrub associated. And then our second group here is what are called facultative species. It's kind of a funky term. Really, that just means that, yeah, they use grasslands a lot, but they're not like totally dependent on it. They're a little bit more generalist. They're going to use some other open habitats as well. And so these guys, we've got red-winged blackbird, common yellowthroat, and field sparrow. And these species tend to be a little bit more tolerant of denser vegetation. They will nest in shrubs. They will nest in big forb clumps. So that's kind of our other group here. Okay, so again, we kind of have this idea that, yes, grasslands are not like old growth forests. We don't see this dramatic like buffering capacity, this big vertical canopy, but there actually is a lot of fine scale variation in vegetation height and productivity, microtopography, topographic adjusted shading, things like that. And so, this is just some drone imagery of one of our grassland sites, and maybe it looks relatively homogeneous. But again, we actually see that there is substantial variation in these climate conditions, particularly, these dark blue dots here. We can see locations of shrubs. We can see drainages that have really tall vegetation. So this is really the stuff that we're talking about. And so the first thing we want to look at is, are grassland birds actually selecting for different microclimates? This is what we would maybe call adaptive selection. So if you're kind of sensitive to really hot conditions, then maybe there would be some selective force for you to actually try to select a more buffered microclimate. But we actually didn't see a lot of evidence for this. So we saw that red-winged blackbird and dickcissel, red-winged blackbird being that facultative species and dickcissel being a little bit more shrub associated, they actually were selecting cooler than random nest site locations. And dickcissel was even selecting more humid than random locations. But for our other species, we really didn't see evidence of that. So this looks like it has more to do maybe with the habitat association of these species rather than selection for microclimate per se. However, we did really see that, that habitat association, the vegetation conditions did affect this microclimate exposure. So although birds were not maybe selecting for these cooler microclimates, the nest sites they were choosing were really affecting the exposure of their nests. So on the y-axis here, we're looking at what we call exposure proportion. And that's basically a metric we calculated that captures kind of the proportion of days for which a nest was active, that it was exposed to what we considered to be extreme heat and dry. And so for heat, we use kind of 39 degrees Celsius. That's sort of an important threshold for a lot of small endotherms. And for dry, we basically use kind of the 20th percentile of the driest air conditions that occurred during our study. And so what we see is that basically these exposures negatively correlated with vegetation density. So basically nests that are kind of in this taller, denser vegetation, they're experiencing an increasingly lower proportion of these extreme conditions. And if we look here on the heat exposure panel, we can also see that for our obligate and facultative groups, there was a significant difference here. So kind of those association of those facultative species with this denser vegetation and their flexibility to use shrub nest sites, that really was reducing their exposure to these extreme climate conditions. And there actually were some demographic consequences associated with this. And so we found that nesting success, that's daily survival rate, for our obligate species actually was declining with these high maximum temperatures quantified at the microclimate level. And we did not see that effect for facultative species. And so it seems like we could really attribute that to that facultative species actually are not having this level of exposure that's affecting their nesting success in the same way that our obligates were. And here's kind of a way that we can visualize that. So this map is showing kind of the average maximum temperature over the season at one of our study sites. And then we've kind of superimposed the locations of the nests of red-winged blackbird with the circle. So that's kind of our facultative species that's using shrubs, using really dense stuff. And you can see it's kind of in some of these cooler areas. So the yellows, the blues, and the greens. And then we have our obligate ground nester grasshopper sparrow denoted by the triangles. And it really is using this kind of exposed sparse vegetation here in this red ridge that runs right through the site. So we really can see how, these species occupy the same small grassland area, but they're really experiencing different exposure based on their preferences. And so, I think one of the big takeaways here is that understanding the unique life histories of species, their microhabitat preferences, how they're interacting with climate at the scales that are relevant to them really could influence how we think about climate vulnerability in this group and potentially how we think about managing them. And so we can see here that, grassland birds really have these different preferences for vegetation height and density. And that's pretty sort of classic for how we think about these species. So, sort of the earliest papers on grassland birds kind of talk about how they're kind of using niche segregation along this kind of density of vegetation heights in grasslands. And that's probably really evolutionarily a result of high predation risk. So they're probably sort of avoiding density effects by diversifying the nest site to avoid competing with each other, and also trying to select nest sites that are going to have a lower predation risk. So, in grasslands, about 40% of nests fail due to predation risk. So it's a really strong selective force. And so I think that, one takeaway of this when we think about climate adaptation is that, we hear a lot about this idea of kind of creating thermal diversity on the landscape as a climate adaptation management approach. And I think that that's a really valid and good approach in many ways that will probably benefit, maybe we're talking about alpha diversity. I think there's probably some real benefits to be gained there. But when we're talking about specialists and species that really don't have high behavioral flexibility, they're really kind of restricted to the habitat preferences that they have. Those species may not benefit all that much from that sort of approach, and maybe we need to look at other approaches for them. So I think that's one takeaway from this work. I think another takeaway, though, is that, we can manage for microclimates. So for some of these more facultative species, for these species like dickcissel, managing for a little bit higher vegetation heights, maybe not mowing during droughts and heat waves, maybe doing more incomplete burns to kind of preserve some of those bunchier patches, maybe doing conservation stocking rates, lesser grazing intensity, especially during droughts. Those can all sort of contribute to maintaining a little bit more structure in grasslands and perhaps providing a little bit more of that habitat buffering for the species that are able to benefit from that. And even for our obligates that really aren't showing a lot of behavioral flexibility, most of those still have a range of densities that they can use. So if we manage maybe just a little bit more towards the upper end of that range, there's potentially some benefits to be had there from a climate adaptation perspective. And more broadly, I think we can think about, conservation planning and sort of the occurrence of microrefugia on the landscape. So maybe we want to prioritize, investment in easements in areas that have a lot of microtopography, or they tend to be a little bit more productive. They tend to maintain that productivity during droughts. So there's lots of things to consider there from a conservation planning perspective as well. And I just want to go ahead and close here with acknowledging all the great people that made this work possible. So of course we had funding from UW, Wisconsin Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit, the Midwest CASC, and the USDA Hatch program. Lots of great technicians that did this work with me, in particular, Beckett Hills and the Townsend Lab at UW collected this drone imagery for us that I could not have done without them. And we also had various agencies and nonprofits and private landowners that let us conduct this work on their lands. And so, yeah, I just want to thank everybody for that. And that is what I had today. I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you, Jacy, and thank you, Olivia. If you guys both want to just stay on video for now, we have plenty of time for Q&A. So attendees, you are welcome to pop questions into the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. Or you can just raise your hand and ask your question directly of our presenters. And I am patient. I will wait for you to ask questions. But I won't call on you unless we get desperate. Question from Kyle. Would you mind going over your management recommendations section again?
Was that a question for me, I'm assuming?
I am guessing so, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So again, I think we want to be careful here because, this is, there's not a lot of replication of studies like this, relatively small sample sizes. So don't want to be super prescriptive here. But I think what I really take from this is like, there's two sort of big implications for grassland birds. One is that, yes, grasslands are diverse enough structurally with topography and vegetation productivity that there is significant variation. And that really has to do with areas that have high productivity, greater structure. And so I think that, yes, some species are not going to be able to benefit from that. So like a grasshopper sparrow just requires really sparse conditions. So even if you provide, taller bunches, it's not going to use those. But some species will. And all these species, maybe grasshopper sparrow can use, height of 10 to 15 centimeters. So if you manage it a little bit more towards 15, it's still going to use that, and it could potentially gain a little bit more buffering capacity. So I think the recommendation there is, basically a little bit lighter stocking rates, being more strategic with mowing, doing more incomplete burns, trying to preserve some refugia. I think that there are potential benefits there that could buffer for some of these species. So that would be sort of one recommendation. And then I think the second one is that, for these really specialized species that really, they're not going to nest in shrubs, they're not going to be able to take full advantage of thermal heterogeneity. For them, I think we really need to look at other kinds of adaptation practices than just providing thermal heterogeneity. And so I think for grassland birds, a big one is connectivity. We know that these species have semi-nomadic life histories, and a lot of them will really move around the landscape in response to extreme drought, for example. And so I think an alternative approach would be keeping grass on the ground and really thinking about landscape context and connectivity, and some of these broader microrefugia type traits like microtopography and things like that, to sort of try to provide more buffered habitat for these guys and provide opportunity for them to move around and avoid sort of regional extremes. So I think that in a nutshell is what I would recommend based on this.
And I have a question about knowledge gaps that I think may be most relevant for Olivia, but Jacy, curious if you have anything to add to it as well. What developments are or will be most relevant moving forward for minimizing the gaps in knowledge about climate's impacts on species adaptation?
Yeah, two, I will say, is balancing what we know between sort of really well-studied species and understudied species and making sure to start filling in those gaps. And then the second one is related to advancing the evidence base for adaptation. So what management interventions can we take? How do they then reduce like thermal exposure or increase adaptive capacity? And then what impact does it have on the population or species? So I would say understudied species and advancing the evidence base for climate adaptation are two.
I would just add to that. I think one of the takeaways from my work for me really is just that these responses can be really idiosyncratic, particularly, we might think, oh, grassland birds are a monolith. They're all in these same areas. They're all going to experience the same thing. And I think that is not always true. And so I think that, yeah, particularly if there's priority species that you really want to do effective management for, you really need to do studies on those species and see how they're actually responding.
That leads into the next question in the chat, which is, Jacy, do you know if many land managers in grassland habitats manage with a microclimate lens currently?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think people are talking about it in literature, but that's a very different thing from people on the ground having capacity to do that. So I think we're seeing this emerge as an adaptation strategy. We're seeing it talked about more in general. But I also think that most managers are, it's already kind of a challenge to create enough structural heterogeneity to support diverse grassland species, to also support production and grazing. So we're asking a lot of grassland managers. And so I can't speak to how many of them are actually doing this in practice right now. And it's not easy. But I do think that we're starting to get a lot more awareness, and not just for grassland birds, but, there's a lot of talk about, incomplete burns and like refugia for pollinators and insects and things like that. So I think, managing for heterogeneity has really been increasingly the paradigm in grasslands. And I think that dovetails pretty well with providing some refugia and thermal heterogeneity as well. So I do think there is opportunity there.
We have another question in the chat, which may or may not, be out of scope for you guys to answer, but I'd also invite any attendees who want to chime in the chat. Please feel free to do so. But I'll put it out there for you too. Unrelated to grasslands, is anyone looking at green rooftops and different types of vegetation to provide stopover habitat in cities? Could this inform which plants to use on rooftops?
Well, I think I don't know specifically of anyone doing research on sort of like stopover habitat for particular species with green rooftops, but I do know that there has been work done. People are talking about the potential value of rooftops for some species, and I think that the question is a good one. Yeah, like I do think there is potential there, particularly in areas where we have increasing urban cover and lack larger high quality habitat areas. So I think it's a good question, but I don't have anything more specific to respond to that with.
Allison, I see you have a longer comment in the chat. If you'd like to ask a question, related to that or make a comment, I'd welcome you to do so.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of a question there, just to say that I think it's really interesting to think about that, we get these really wet periods and then we have droughts and, the year to year, like I've just kind of seen a lot of bouncing around on these kind of graphs. And so it'd be interesting to have a more longitudinal look at this kind of stuff. And, my first reaction is like, it's really sad that they don't seem to be able to adjust. But then I wonder if maybe they didn't need to at that exact moment that you studied them. So kind of curious, like whether or over time whether we'd start to see adaptation. So
Yeah,
those would be
I
kind of neat to get into. That's all.
I think you're spot on with that comment. I mean, I think in general, right, grasslands are these high variation environments, and we know that grassland birds also move around a lot and track these conditions across the landscape. But I think your question about it's really a question of sort of the relative importance of these selective pressures. So I think currently you could argue that grassland birds, their nesting preferences are probably driven by sort of the ghost of predation past in a way. That's probably the strongest selective force. But I think as climate becomes more extreme, I think it's absolutely possible that we might start to see the balance of those selective forces change. We might see species start to shift. But I think the question is always going to be, do they have the capacity to do it quickly enough?
Holly, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay? I'm yeah, driving. Let me know if there's issues. My question is really related to what Jacy just mentioned and what others have mentioned around like the temporal component of this. And thinking about kind of what you just touched on rather than year to year variability, like within year variability and like how long does a microclimate need to be available to kind of serve its purpose and provide that refuge. And yeah, just would love thoughts on kind of the temporal aspect of this.
Yeah, so I think we did look we were able to look at that a little bit because we had the temporal eye button data for every day of the season, but for drone flights we only had those kind of early, middle, and late. So I wasn't able to look at like super fine scale variation in how things could change. So I think there's potential for that. And I think there's also potential for like, what are conditions like while you're selecting the nest versus like what do they become while your nest is active, and things of that nature. And one thing that we did find that I didn't emphasize here is that kind of this contrast in microclimates became greater on hot and sunny days. And so on these days where you're having a really extreme temperature, you're actually seeing a larger difference between the microclimates and the mean conditions. So those anomalies get bigger. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for kind of fine scale temporal variation and variation in sort of macroclimate conditions that can really affect how important these are. And birds may or may not be fully attuned to be able to sort of optimize those things based on their selection.
Thanks, everybody, for the great questions. I'll hang out for a minute here to see if anybody else raises their hand or anybody pops anything else into the chat. What does this make you want to study next?
Well, I think for my part, so I think my study is really an example of in many ways we didn't see adaptive selection, and that's actually very common. So adaptive selection is talked about a lot more than it's ever found in nesting birds. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we're not always able to look at like carryover effects to other parts of life history. So I would have loved to be able to look at how this affects juvenile survival, and how juveniles are actually selecting microclimates, and things like that. So I think there's a lot of potential to better understand that. And then I would also love to just be able to explicitly do some management and see how that affects microclimate heterogeneity, and then link that to, that's really what this is about for me, is like, we'd love to be able to take that next step of actually being more confidently prescriptive. So, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to start wrapping us up, but if anyone has a last minute question, we do still have a few minutes, so feel free to shout it out or pop it in the chat. Thank you so much to Olivia and Jacy for the presentations and for taking the time to join us today. I'm going to pop a quick poll up, and please, if you wouldn't mind completing that before you hop off, we really appreciate. Oops, not that one. Hold on, there we go. If you'd complete the quick poll, we'd appreciate it. And it looks like maybe we did get a question in the chat.
Yeah, so my previous work on energy development in grassland birds was not solar. So it was conventional shallow oil, natural gas. Um, and basically what we found is that yeah, many species experience reduced reproductive success, which we kind of attributed to basically introducing edge habitats and probably kind of creating inroads for these generalist predators into these kind of otherwise undisturbed grasslands. I think solar is super important. There's not been enough work done on that. I think that's really going to be like one of the major land use issues that we're going to face in the Western United States. And I would expect that we will probably see similar effects of that. So I would expect it will probably be negative. If nothing else, it's just going to be taking up potentially a lot of grassland habitat. So yeah.
Thanks for spending time with us today, everybody. I invite you